Hello everyone, you're listening to the Eiffel Tower. My name's Oliver G. This is a show all about Paris. Excuse me? Excuse me, my turn here. This is a show all about Paris or France, but right now, as I'm on paternity leave, you're hearing the audio experience from my 2020 book, Paris on Air. Today, you're going to hear Chapter 7, which means there's only 2 chapters left. Little Otis, who's sitting beside me right now, isn't a character, but I'm glad he's showing podcasting sensibilities so early. But in this chapter, you're going to hear... Stop! Shh. In this chapter, you're going to hear everything from World Cup pandemonium to sort of getting a little bit more into this very podcast and the guest that I had. A little talk about the studio, and it ends with an almighty scene of our wedding where, well, you're going to hear it, but everything went wrong. Or so it seemed. I hope you enjoy this chapter. At the end, I'll read the sole review that anyone left, even though I asked last week for reviews, so you probably know who you are before we get to it, but it was a fun one. And if you're a Patreon supporter, the scroll that I've already published this week is a pretty nice one, actually. There's a way deeper dive into the studio. Pictures you've probably never seen. The door to it is fantastic, by the way. I never really thought about it until we started putting this together. Some of the podcast, a map or two of Paris, a particularly intriguing page that Eddie's titled To Smile or Not to Smile, with some deep dives into the whole smiling thing in France. And then wedding pictures. So there's like 3 pages of wedding pictures that will help you understand how it all went wrong, I think. And some lovely wedding pictures there too. But anyway, that's enough of that. Patreon.com/The Eiffel Tower if you want to see this show improve. As for me, I've got a boy on my lap. I better make sure he's okay. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with all new episodes. Enjoy Chapter 7. Here we go. Chapter 7. A proposal, teaching at university, and World Cup pandemonium. 7.1 The Podcast. The new podcasting studio was in another chambre de bonne, a tiny maid's quarters, on Rue Lafayette near the Gare du Nord train station. Of course, there was no elevator, so that meant trudging up 6 flights of steps, often with a guest in tow. And if I thought my first apartment was petite, this one took the prize. I feel sorry for any maid who lived in it. It was a square room, the length of a pool table, though it did have a nice little view. There was a table in the middle with a few microphones facing the chairs, a small desk to one side, and a mini fridge in the corner. And it did the trick perfectly. Imagine, a radio studio in the heart of Paris, broadcasting to the world from under the rooftops. I did weekly episodes with special guests, and I was getting to meet some interesting faces from the Paris scene. I'd started with bloggers, food writers, YouTubers, and authors, and moved on to comedians, actors, and tour guides. I talked to cafe owners, chefs, priests, photographers, TV stars, ambassadors, and mayors. If someone had something to say about life in France, I was there to listen. As all of these people shared their podcast appearances with their own fans, the show gained new followers, and it was encouraging to see the downloads grow. I spent so much time in the studio that the radio station eventually gave me my own key. I could use the space whenever I wanted. I taught myself more about the production side of things, how best to edit audio, and surprised myself by enjoying it. Editing audio is like being able to speak a secret language. If you wear headphones and edit in public, like on a plane or in a cafe, then the person next to you can watch your every move and have no idea what you're doing. All they see are the squiggly lines like a heart monitor. But what was I actually editing on the shows? The truth is, not much. One of the joys of recording the podcast episodes was that I did it like it was live. If a neighbor started drilling, if an alarm went off in the distance, if someone walked into the studio, and all that has happened, then I just rolled with it and left it in the final recording. This is partly because I liked the flow of a live show and thought it was more authentic, but also because it made for less editing work, and people seemed to like it. I'd get emails from nostalgic travelers who felt like they were in Paris again when they heard a siren in the background, and thought, even for the briefest of moments, that the siren was outside their own window. I was learning that if I couldn't bring these Francophiles to Paris, At least I could bring Paris to them. All the while, the emails continued to pour in. One woman said she'd been inspired to move to Paris after listening to the show, and apparently she did. There were little groups of listeners in pockets around the world who'd meet to discuss recent episodes, guests, and their own dreams of Paris. It was around this point that I considered getting sponsorships, but I had no idea how to do it. I'd never worked in sales and marketing. I was unorganized. I didn't know where to start. But, as fortune would have it, an email dropped into my inbox with an opportunity for a new experience and the chance to pay off a few bills. "7.2 The Teacher." When you move to a new country, the 3-year mark is an achievement that grants you access to an elite club. It's impressive to newer expats, and even to French people. It's almost like you can be taken more seriously because you've served your time and you've earned some respect. In any case, on the day of my 3-year anniversary in France, I got an email from a professor at the American University of Paris.
"Oliver, would you be interested in teaching podcasting to undergrads as a side gig? Maybe we can go for a coffee and a chat."
I met the professor soon after on the left bank in a little cafe of his choice, not far from the university and in the Eiffel Tower's shadow. He ordered café crèmes for us both and dipped his croissant into the coffee as he spoke. He was obviously a lifer. Only the French dunk their pastries in coffee. I dunked mine in too as if it were the most normal thing in the world and put the disgusting wet pastry into my mouth.
Why is everyone obsessed with the right bank these days? Those fuckers have no idea. What, there's a few new coffee shops? There's nothing over there that the left bank can't offer.
I'd just been about to mention how pleasant it was that I'd ventured across the river for a change. I kept quiet.
I saw you did a whole episode about the left bank. Good. Anyway, I'll cut the bullshit. Podcasting is the new side of journalism, right? So our journalism students need to learn it, yes? And you can teach them, right? If so, come next Thursday.
That was it. We organized the rest over email, and as I scooted to the safety of the right bank, I wondered what had happened. I taught a few different groups of students over the coming months. They were doing degrees in anthropology, journalism, and sociology, and their professors wanted to keep up with the online world. I taught the students how to record audio, edit it, add sound effects, and clip it together into a short podcast. The results were usually impressive, and it felt good to pass on some of the lessons I'd learned. But while I enjoyed teaching, nothing could beat the scooter drive to the university. I'll go out on a limb here and say it was the best scooter commute in the world. Imagine this. I started in the 11th arrondissement, headed down past the Place de la République and the towering statue of Marianne, the symbol of France. Then I ducked left, passed alongside the colourful Pompidou Museum of Modern Art, then zipped across the Seine River with the Notre Dame Cathedral to my left. When I reached the left bank, I turned right and followed the Seine almost all the way to the Eiffel Tower, passing the Musée d'Orsay, which was once a train station and is now home to a world-class art collection. I also passed between the gold dome of the Invalides and the extravagant Pont Alexandre III. As the Eiffel Tower got closer, I swung left, parked the bike, and taught the students, while still on a Paris high from that glorious ride. And to think, just a year earlier, I'd have taken the metro. "7.3 Smile." People warn you that you shouldn't smile in Paris. What nonsense. Don't listen to those miserable people. Listen to me instead. You should smile in Paris. You should smile everywhere too, not just here. Haven't they done studies that smiling in general makes you happier? Why not smile right now? Go on, do it. Have a little chuckle so the person near you wonders what you're listening to. Go on, really sell that chuckle. They'll probably ask about this story. Tell them a little bit about it. Tell them about the podcast. Hey, why don't you get them to subscribe? Did you do it? Or are you alone in the room? Doesn't matter, smile anyway. There you go, now you're feeling better, aren't you? Anyway, the point is that people are ultra friendly in Paris if you walk in and smile. I'm talking about shopkeepers, cafe owners, waiters, bartenders, bankers, those kinds of people. No need to smile on the metro or on the street or wherever you don't feel like getting unwanted attention. But I've found that starting an interaction with a smile will open all kinds of doors in Paris. I had Caroline de Maigret on my show once, the supermodel who wrote How to Be Parisian Wherever You Are, and she was smiling the whole time. She even smiled in the photo that I took with her after the recording. On the show, she said this.
I want to be living in a world where people are actually nice and smile and try to be good to each other.
So where did this myth come from that Parisians don't smile? Who cares? The point is you should ignore it. Instead, here's my little tip if you want to make a Parisian smile back at you. Now, this only really works if you speak a tiny bit of French, and not too much, mind you. You go into the shop or the cafe, you smile at the person, and when they say bonjour, you respond with bonjour ça va, meaning of course hello, how are you? Any Parisians listening to me now will probably be scoffing, as will most French people in general, because it's absolutely not done in France. French people never ask strangers how they're going. What a waste of time, and they don't care either. And to be fair, why would you care? But that's the whole point. I know this is true, and yet I'm doing it still on purpose. You see, ça va, C-A-V-A, those two little words, those four little letters, are playing an enormous role in setting the scene and putting you in it. All in the space of 1 second, you've made it clear that you're a foreigner. You've also shown that you're a friendly foreigner, a smiling friendly foreigner. Yes, you're a foreigner who's breaking the code of never asking strangers how they're going, but you're also making an effort to speak French. And no matter how good your French accent is, they'll also glean that you're still learning because no fluent French speaker would ever go around saying ça va to strangers. Like I said, there's a lot going on here, but I'd wager that 4 times out of 5, they'll roll with you and smile too. Hey, they might even ask where you're from. Once I said ça va, and the monsieur concluded that I was Canadian since I was being way too friendly for a Frenchman. They'll often laugh too. At least they do with me, because for some reason it's such an unusual situation in France to ask someone you don't know, how are you, that it becomes downright funny. So if you're feeling plucky and fancy a conversation, this is perhaps the best way to start it. It's a guaranteed smile. Now, if you enjoyed that tip, I got one more for you. People in France will affectionately joke that someone who can't speak the local lingo speaks French like a Spanish cow, comme une vache espagnole. Now, I've got no idea what a Spanish cow has done to deserve this little simile, but I do know that it's a great gateway into a conversation. Instead of saying, I don't speak French, or my French isn't very good, do as I do and say, Je parle français comme une vache australienne. I speak French like an Australian cow. You see what I did there? I switched Spanish to the much more personally relevant Australian, and it works wonders. It'll loosen the mood, let them know you're not a fluent French speaker, let them know that you have a sense of humor, and it'll even let them know where you're from. Try it. All you need to remember is to change Australienne to wherever you're from. Perhaps you're a vache américaine, or anglaise, or péruvienne. Wherever you're from, just remember to make the nationality feminine to match the cow, even if you're a man. Although, to be completely fair, if you're saying you speak French like an American cow, then it might even sell it better to get the cow's gender mixed up. The point with all this is whoever started this story about not smiling in France is some miserable old cow with no sense of humor. Don't be like that person. Be a happy cow and smile about it. Yes, smile. And the French will smile with you. .4 The Proposal. It was somewhere around this point that I proposed to Lena. Life with her was too wonderful, so I bought a ring, hid it in my pocket, then proposed to her on a rainy night in Paris, right in the middle of the bridge by the Louvre. You already know this story, remember? It was at the beginning of the audio experience. It was quite a special night, even besides the engagement. We'd decided to tie in John Baxter's birthday with cocktails at the Ritz, which had been a Christmas present from my parents. It turned out to be one of the most memorable nights of our lives. The Ritz bar, where we headed after the proposal, was impressive too. We didn't bother telling the staff we'd just gotten engaged. Instead, we enjoyed the wildly expensive cocktails with glowing smiles on our faces. Then, as we left, we called our families to share the news, and there were tears of joy from Australia to Sweden. When I later told Baxter about the proposal, the bridge, the rain, and the Ritz, he said it should be the first chapter of this very book. Good thinking, John. There was no denying it. We were in love. Me and Lena, of course, not me and Baxter. Baxter and I were just friends. But as for Lena, well, I proposed to her in December, and we decided to get married in July, in Sweden. Sure, 6 months isn't a very long engagement, but why wait? We'd initially planned to have a small ceremony in a French chateau after the fun of my 30th birthday party, but the more we looked into the logistics of getting married in France, the more we shied away from it. If I thought the admin for getting a new bank account was difficult, imagine the paperwork for two foreigners to get married. After some deliberation, where does an Australian marry a Swede anyway? We decided that it would be easiest to tie the knot in Sweden. Lena's parents offered their back garden for the reception in a small village called Mariefred outside of Stockholm. And that was that. We settled on a date, invited friends from around the world, and we booked a church for the ceremony. In Sweden, it's customary to meet with a local priest ahead of the wedding so they can get to know you and learn your story. We met ours in the town's white stone church, which was built in 1624 and stands proudly on a little hill by the lake. Our priest, a soft-spoken man in his 50s with the faintest hint of a lisp, took us into his office to flesh out the details.
Hey, Lena, and nice to meet you, Mr. Oliver J.
When we asked if he could hold the ceremony in half English, half Swedish, he said,
Well, I might struggle with the English part, just a little bit.
We said we didn't mind if his speech was a little Swinglish, but I was more concerned that he couldn't pronounce my last name. My last name, G, is pronounced exactly like the seventh letter of the alphabet in English. You already knew this. G. But he kept saying,
Oliver J. Oliver J. That's it. I got it. It's perfect. Oliver J.
Oh, you're so close, but you haven't quite got it. It's not Yi, it's J, like J, like in genius or gem or J.
I'm terribly sorry, but we don't have that sound in Swedish.
The priest looked at me in consternation, and I was worried too that Lena would be married to Oliver Yee and not me. I know, I said. It's pronounced G as in Jesus. Jesus. The priest looked dismayed.
But in Sweden we call him Jesus.
It crossed my mind to suggest he say Chi, C-H-E-E, which sounds more like G than Ye does, but I feared he'd end the ceremony with,
Ladies and gentlemen, I now present the cheese.
The priest promised he'd practice his pronunciation, and I went back to Paris to knuckle down on work. After all, who wants to marry a struggling podcaster? $7.5, the salary. Even though podcasts have been around for decades, believe it or not, there's no script for how to make money out of them. Adverts are the obvious answer, but I didn't know how to get them, and was reluctant to dilute the show with promotions about mattresses, as many other shows do. At this point, I'd been running the podcast for about a year, and I was still broke. Sure, I'd given the occasional walking tour, put on a couple of live shows, and taught podcasting classes at university, but I had no regular income by any stretch of the imagination. So I was left with one probing question. How do you make money out of a podcast? This is, incidentally, the question that I get asked the most in my life, so here's the answer, once and for all, and how I figured it out. While I didn't have a salary, I did have a following, and it was a kind and generous set of followers. I'd met with many of them over the previous year, and they often told me they were coming to Paris and would love to buy me a drink. In those days, I met with everyone, thrilled to know that anyone was listening to my show. I used to be so flattered that I would even buy the listeners drinks as a thanks. It was surreal to meet actual human beings who listened to the show, because up to this point, they'd just been emailers or online statistics. After a while, as I met more listeners, I stopped buying the drinks. That wasn't helping with the whole salary thing. But I still met them, and I started to see a pattern. Firstly, it was clear to me that many of them were Paris addicts, desperate to soak up anything about this enchanting city. And I'd been quenching their thirst for Paris while joining them on their often long commutes on the other side of the world. and unlike other Paris blogs, books, or YouTube channels, I was quite intimately introducing the listeners to real-life characters who made the City of Light shine. Giving the guests 30 minutes to talk about themselves in Paris revealed a raw and honest perspective on the city that people weren't getting elsewhere. But the funny thing was that many of the listeners felt like they knew me too. I mean, I suppose I was sharing a fair chunk of my own life, but it was fun to see how listeners handled this differently. Some figured that since they knew me, I must know them too, so they'd sit down and start telling me about their lives, their hometowns, and what they were doing in Paris. Others would sit silently and wait for me to talk, perhaps feeling like they didn't want to interrupt the live podcast they were experiencing. Some wanted to pick my brain about what to do in Paris or how they could move here, but heck, everyone was different and I was happy to meet them all. Some listeners took it a step further, sending me photos of their pets or gifts in the mail, like books about Paris or treats from their home city. As time passed, some would invite me to dinners, parties, or trips out of Paris. Eventually, I decided to draw a line, and I drew it at meeting for a coffee. But the problem remained. As pleasant as it was to meet new people and to be treated to a drink, I needed to turn a switch somewhere and somehow create a salary. Otherwise, I couldn't justify doing the show anymore. The podcast was getting around 30,000 downloads a month, which I learned, in those days at least, was enough to put it in the top 10% of all podcasts in the world. Not bad for a one-man job, not least considering how many other podcasts had big companies behind them or came from radio stations like the BBC. So, rather than trying to get advertising, I decided to try to get the listeners to fund the show. I discovered a crowdfunding website called Patreon, which allowed followers to give regular pledges to small creative platforms. It was like a magazine subscription. People paid a monthly fee, but instead of getting a magazine, they got some kind of extra access, like this audio experience, for example. It took me a while to figure out what to give in return for people's subscription and how much to charge for it, but as luck would have it, my crowdfunding launch occurred at the same time as Facebook rolled out live videos, where you can press record on a live stream and the followers would get a notification to watch. And it made sense for me. Paris is the most beautiful city on the planet, so why should I only focus on audio? I decided to carry out bonus interviews with my guests as we walked around Paris, pointing out anything worth seeing. It was kind of like a talk show, but while walking. I called it a walk show, and that was that. The podcast remained free, but if you wanted to see the live walk shows, you'd have to become a paying member. I made it clear from the outset that membership wasn't some sympathy crowdfunding thing, rather that it was access to a club where people could choose to see more of Paris. It felt like a pretty big risk at the time because it meant doing a lot of extra work then hiding it. But I took the chance and I did it, and I'm glad I did. Those early days were rough though. There were so few members and they were spread out across the world, and that meant that if I were to do a live video in the morning, the Americans would be asleep, and I'd have to hope that an Australian or maybe two was awake. The first walk show I ever did was me alone walking around the left bank and only one viewer tuned in. It seemed so hopeless, so pointless, and I felt like I was wasting that one person's time. Yet I pushed on, because I believed in the idea. Gradually, more members joined and I made more live videos. I made them as engaging and as interactive as possible. If someone at home typed a question in the comment field, I'd answer it or I'd read it out loud to the guest as it came in. It was live and it was raw. I took cues from the audience, zooming in on something they'd seen in the distance, showing the road signs so they could find the same streets for themselves, and making them feel like they were in Paris too. The advantage I had over all the countless travel shows about Paris and beyond was that my shows were immediate and in real time. There was no editing. If something went wrong, we had to deal with it on the spot. And believe me, things went wrong in those early days. Once I did a video with the Australian ambassador to France, Brendan Byrne. It was a huge deal for me, the first guest where I had to go through a press team. They'd put the word unclassified on all of their emails, which made me nervous from the outset. We were to walk along the Bir Hakeim Bridge by the embassy, the same bridge from the opening scene of Last Tango in Paris. I planned to do the same walk as Marlon Brando had done before me. The ambassador's press team followed us along worriedly in the distance. The same press team that had advised him against doing a live video. And they were right to be concerned. When I pressed the live button on my phone and we started the show, my camera equipment went berserk. The stabilizer spun out of control like a headless chicken, like something from The Exorcist. And there was nothing I could do about it. It was live. I forced the camera into submission and tried to steer a serious interview, but the camera kept trying to spin. The ambassador laughed it off, but I still have nightmares about it. It's a wonder he ever agreed to let me host a blowout soiree in his magnificent residence 1 year later, but that's for the end of the book. Those early walk shows, well, they were a crazy ride, I can tell you. If you've never seen one of them, let me explain why they're so mad. First, I had to concentrate on operating the camera to focus on me and the guest, or whatever we were looking at. Second, I needed to make sure that we were going the right way and never just standing still. That's crucial. We had to be walking, otherwise we might as well have stayed in the studio. Plus, Paris was the real guest of the video and people wanted to see it. Third, and perhaps most importantly, I needed to maintain an engaging conversation with the guest, keeping in mind that they weren't always comfortable with being live on the internet. Fourth, I needed to make sure I was keeping an eye on the comments from people tuning in around the world, because without them, there was no point in doing it live. Interaction was key. And last of all, I needed to make sure I wasn't going to get hit by a car or step in any surprises that a dog or a horse may have left behind. Yes, it was mad, but I absolutely loved it. And I was fortunate that at the time, no one else was doing live interviews on the streets of Paris. It was something new, and there was an appetite for it. As I started to promote the membership platform more, and as I managed to convince more guests to go for a walk with me, the members began to sign up more regularly. Gradually, the Paris podcast fans became too curious about the videos, or maybe they just wanted me to succeed. But either way, they kept trickling in and the group kept growing. It wasn't a quick process, but I gave it my all. When I hit that live button, I'd find people were ready and waiting, and there'd be 15 people watching, where once there was only one. I got to know the names of the more talkative members and learned their personalities from their comments. Corinne in Australia would never miss a show.
Hi Oliver, hi Lena.
Brian in Victoria would always be first with feedback.
G'day Oliver, Brian Fitzgerald the golf doctor here.
Cindy and James in Chicago would set an alarm and get up at any hour to watch.
Hi, it's Cindy and Jim from Chicago.
Deborah in Virginia would always be the first to comment.
Bonjour, Ronald and Deborah Paul, coming to you from Virginia.
This thing was growing. I stopped doing all other forms of work, whether it was freelance journalism or teaching at the university, and I set my sights on a tangible target, reaching France's minimum wage via podcast subscription. If enough members joined the club, if my total monthly earnings could equal that of the elusive minimum wage, then it would be official. It would be a job. Around 9 months after I did the first ever walk show with its solitary home viewer, the collective monthly pledges added up to match the minimum wage. It was an incredibly satisfying feeling. Yes, I'd invented a job. My own job. As a podcaster, no less. Now, I don't know, this might not sound like such a big deal to all you people out there earning much more than minimum wage, but for me, it was such a validating moment that I could have cried. Sure, I was only earning the kind of money that I could get flipping burgers at a fast food joint, but I didn't care. I'd quit my old job, aimed to make it on my own, and I'd done it. .6 The Catacombs. There's a certain point in the life of a podcast where things just change. It's definitely not an overnight thing, but there's a perceptible point where you realize it's become its own entity. It could be when it starts to earn money, but I don't think that's really it. I think it's more about the moment when people start to accept its existence. I suppose it's like anything really, trends, fashion, computer games. As long as enough people give it a seal of approval, the crowds will follow. For me, I started to realize that it had become a real thing when I started to get much more regular emails. Sometimes they were really touching. People who said they'd use the show as a kind of therapy when they were going through hard times. Some people emailed to tell me how they bonded with their loved ones while cooking at home with my show on in the background. Others said they'd binge listen to all the episodes back to back on long road trips. These are my favorite emails, especially when people told me where they were listening. One had his earphones in while mowing the lawn in Texas. One listened while doing the laundry in Peru. There was one fan on the commuter trains of Tokyo, and there was a fairly vocal Fiji contingent. In fact, it was quite easy to organize the statistics to see which cities the downloads were coming from, and it boggled my mind. There were listeners in Greenland, Namibia, Jamaica. There were listeners on islands I never heard of before, and all this added a weird kind of pressure. I felt that even though it was just an independent little show, I had a responsibility to give it my best shot, and so I did. In addition to the listeners, people who wanted to be guests on the show would email me. And this is often exciting too. At first, the emails were often way off the mark. And they still are, by the way. But sometimes they were nuggets of gold, like the beekeeper. He'd heard about the podcast through a friend and told me he'd like to show me something special. He explained that he kept beehives on the top of the city's prominent buildings and made his own Parisian honey, which was impressive enough. But he wanted to show me his latest project, honey wine, or mead, I suppose it's called. And where do you think he aged the mead? Why, down in the catacombs, of course. But not in the touristy part with all the skeletons. No. He had a private little labyrinth that you could only enter if you went through a hospital and gave a secret knock on a door. I accepted the invite and met him at the hospital. And when his colleagues opened the door and let us in, we went down, 30 meters under Paris into a stone maze. We turned left, right, and left again, all with his pet beagle following along. We eventually came to his corner of the catacombs, and we feasted on wine and cheese that was slathered in his own Parisian honey. Unfortunately, the beekeeper's English wasn't great, so he never made it onto the podcast, and he was reluctant to let me film in the catacombs for fears that urban explorers would find his secret tunnels and then take his wine. So, the beekeeper was never on the show, but his tale remains one of the many follow-up stories I've got in my notes and that I hope to share one day. Whenever I think of the beekeeper, I wonder just how many stories there are in this city that I've never heard of, and I'm reminded by how much I want to find them and tell them. But these stories were about to take a back seat. I had a wedding to host, a honeymoon to plan, and my Paris mates had organized a bachelor weekend in Amsterdam. And if you think 8 mates together in Amsterdam sounds wild, then you better strap in. France was about to hold a party that would blow everything out of the water and into the stratosphere. .7, the World Cup. A young woman was standing on the bridge, almost totally naked, and peering down into the murky waters of the Canal Saint-Martin. With one hand, she held the railing behind her, plucking up the courage to make the mighty leap into the water below. Thousands stared at her from the waterside, cheering. Allez les bleus! She yelled, leaping from the bridge and hitting the water with a splash that was drowned out by the roar of the crowd. As the cheering continued, another man climbed up over the railing and hung from the bridge by his fingertips. With his other hand, he removed his shorts, and his bare buttocks shone in the Paris twilight. He hung free and easy in the gentle breeze while the crowd broke into hysterical laughter. Then, he let go and fell into the water too. More nudity, more splashes, more cheering. On the road behind them, young men with faces painted red, white, and blue climbed onto moving vehicles, drinks in hand, and danced on the rooftops. All the while, car horns were beeping, people were cheering, and music was playing. And I stood there with mouth agape, wondering what the hell was going on. Now, of course, I knew what was happening. France's national soccer team had just beaten Croatia 4-2 and won the World Cup for the first time in 20 years. And it was pandemonium in Paris. But nothing could prepare me for just how extensive the party was. You see, soccer's like a religion in France, and the celebrations went on long after the final whistle was blown. I imagine no one got much sleep that night, all on a Sunday too. For a little perspective here, when I first moved to Paris, I remember sitting in a pretty typical bar, definitely not a sports bar by any means. On the wall was a digital clock that had stopped ticking. On closer inspection, I saw that it had stopped during the evening of July 12th in 1998. I asked a French friend what had happened at that time and date, and he looked at me with a nostalgic twinkle in his eye and said, without missing a beat,
that's when we last won the World Cup, la victoire des Bleus. It was the best day of my life.
Now me, I'm not a huge soccer fan, but I always find mobs of people to be interesting. I walked along the canal trying to fathom why the result of the game had left these people so ecstatic. I filmed a few live videos to capture the mood, but the throngs of people all using their phones at the same time meant that the internet didn't last very long. I walked towards the Place de la République, the same square where I'd seen millions gather after the Charlie Hebdo attacks. There were similar-sized crowds now, but it was a wildly different mood. It was the middle of summer, there was a lot more skin, and a lot more drunkenness. As for me, I wasn't celebrating. I was more in a state of hungover confusion. I'd just stepped off the train from Gare du Nord, freshly back from my bachelor weekend in Amsterdam. The trip had been organised by my French mates, the majority of whom had left Amsterdam a day early to watch the final from the safety of home turf. However, I was happy to see the game on the train and to observe the celebrations after. As wild, crazy, and slightly worrying as it all seemed, it felt like the good news that France had been needing for a while. And with my own wedding just around the corner, I was looking forward to some celebrations of my own. The wedding. I look back on our wedding in Sweden with mixed feelings. On the one hand, it was the best day of my life, joining lovely Lena in holy matrimony and starting our journey of living together happily ever after. The wedding was wonderful. Friends and family came from afar. Our ceremony was in a picturesque Swedish church, the reception was elegant, and the speeches were touching. But on the other hand, an awful lot seemed to go wrong, and I've come to believe that that wedding was ever so slightly cursed. And that story is too good not to share, even in a book about Paris. It was in Paris that the troubles began, in fact. Right as we were heading to the airport to take the last flight of the night, we were alerted that our flight had been cancelled. No further explanations were given. No further explanations were needed. It meant that we got to Sweden a day late and via Munich. We arrived to find the country in the midst of a sweltering heat wave. Due to our delay, many of the little tasks we'd left for the last minute were pushed to the last second. For example, just hours before we were to exchange vows, Lena and I were redoing the seating arrangement after an unexpected rethinking of the table layout. No big deal, sure, and we were glad to do it, even though the heat wave made us wish we were relaxing over a glass of lemonade and sitting by a fan. The reception was to be held in Lena's parents' back garden, an open-air afternoon and evening. As we fixed the seating plan, we handed the name tags to our family and friends who scurried around, setting them on the tables as directed and putting out cutlery and menus. And oh, what beautiful menus! Lena, who can illustrate even better than she can bake, had designed intricate booklets complete with information about the meals and also sketches and funny facts about the guests to help them break the ice. Little did we know that almost all of those booklets would be destroyed beyond recognition in just a few hours. The heat continued to bear down on the little Swedish town as the ceremony grew nearer. Before we knew it, it was time to get ready. With 5 minutes until we had to head to the nearby church, one of my brothers said, "By the way, does anyone know how to tie a bow tie?" The answer was no. None of us had internet connection on our phone and there was no one to help. Everyone else was at the church already, of course, and I couldn't help them either. I'd opted for a tie. The boys, none of whom speak Swedish, mind you, ended up running through the town with undone bow ties flailing in their hands, yelling for help.
Help! Help! Does anyone speak English? Can anyone tie a bow tie? Hey, Hedge, Engleska? Bow tieska? Quickly! Anyone? Anyone?
I was striding to keep up with them, cautious of my wedding suit getting ever stickier in the unbearable heat. As the church bell struck 2, the time for our ceremony, I found my brothers in the front garden of a neighbour's I'd never met before, where some older village locals were helping with the bow ties. Already late, we ran the rest of the way to the church as the sun beat down on us. And when we arrived, the white stone church loomed above us, and I saw a sight that was to be one of the finest of the wedding. There, in front of the church, were all my friends who were waiting for us to arrive. Guests had come from 5 different continents for the big day, and, touchingly, they included our friends from France, the voices of many you've already heard in this audio experience, and all of whom were so instrumental in shaping my life in Paris. Fabien the Breton was there, and so was Stefan, my neighbour. Clovis, my banking aide, came along, and so did Cyril, my first right then left kissing mate from Nice. Slim and the Beast, the band that helped me start my show, had brought their guitars from Paris and were to be the evening's entertainment. Now, you typically wait inside the church, of course, but the heat wave had turned a 7th century building into a sauna, and on the hill out the front there was a refreshing breeze. My friends cheered as we all arrived and asked where Lena was, and I admit it was the first time I'd thought about her in hours. Wasn't she here already? We were already late. We all rushed up to the church and the priest greeted me, asking me when Lena would arrive. I have no idea. She was getting ready in the bridal suite of a nearby hotel. The minutes passed. Soon she was 10 minutes late. Then 15. The guests inside were sweltering, fanning themselves with Bibles. But where's Lena? Was she going to leave me at the altar? I went to the front door of the church again and stood at the top of the steep staircase looking over the town below. Gathered by now was apparently the entire village, no doubt curious about all the foreign guests, the groomsmen running around with their bow ties, and the potential scandal of a missing bride. She should be here by now. 20 minutes late? When do I throw it all in and leave? I looked to the glistening lake by the side of the church, twinkling in the July sunlight. I looked out over the wooden red homes, so iconic across the Swedish countryside, and I wondered how an Australian guy like me was getting married in Sweden. Or was supposed to be getting married. Then I looked back to the villagers. And what was this? They were poking each other, jostling amongst themselves, taking out their phones and pointing across the village square. And there, like a beacon of shining light, with two bridesmaids in hot pursuit, came a vision of pure beauty. My bride. With a stunning wedding dress she'd made herself, she sailed over the cobblestones of Mariefred with the grace of a movie star. I met her halfway down the stairs. The priest, in a heavy smock and satin sash, breathed a sigh of relief and let the ceremony begin, as the organist played a subtle rendition of Dancing Queen by ABBA. We were in Sweden, after all. Lena told me later that because of the extreme heat, she couldn't manage to slip her wedding dress onto her body. The hotel had no air conditioning, and she'd spent half an hour wriggling into the dress. In the rush and nervous haste, she had left the hotel at a trot and was sweating almost as profusely as I was. In fact, she almost fainted at the altar as I stood beside her, sweating through my suit. Everybody in the church, including me, was far too busy fanning themselves to notice whether the priest, with his strong Swedish accent, pronounced my name as Oliver Yee or G. I don't think anyone would have cared anyway. The point is, we did it. We were married, we'd gotten hitched without a hitch, or at least without any major ones. And oh, that moment of leaving the church was miraculous. Everyone could breathe again in the fresh air. Lena's extended family, many of whom were musicians, surprised us all by producing violins, an enormous marching band drum, and huge sprigs of birch trees, and then led us all in procession back to the house to the tune of Swedish folk music. Meanwhile, a French friend, Greg, had brought an unusual music box with him from Paris, which he played at the back of the procession. He'd strapped it to his chest, and when he wound the handle, it played songs from his phone, and the faster he wound that dial, the louder the music played. The villagers were loving the show. At the time, I thought it was curious indeed that Greg brought such a machine to our wedding, but I'd later thank him for it. After a morning of madness, everything seemed to have righted itself. Slim and the Beast were waiting at the garden to greet us with an acoustic set as guests mingled over champagne. The sky was bright blue and made a perfect backdrop for family photos. Before long, we'd sat at the garden tables for the meal. I relaxed, amazed that we'd pulled it off, getting everyone together for a celebration like this. It all seemed too good to be true. And of course, it was. In the space of 3 seconds, the summer sky turned dark. Clouds hurtled in, draining the color from the party below, almost in slow motion. I turned to the father of the bride. He turned to me. We were definitely moving in slow motion. We looked towards the tarpaulins that we'd fastened to a nearby wall that morning, ready to be unfurled at the first hint of rain. But it was too late. A raindrop crashed so hard on the table between us all that it made a ripple in my wine glass. And then another, a third, and in unison, all the guests went quiet and slowly looked up to the heavens. And then, chaos.
Oh my goodness!
The monster that followed was so quick, so heavy, and so violent that no one knew what to do. It was like a dam burst in the clouds and no one could move fast enough. We had 80 people in the garden, most of whom were midway through their first course as the storm struck. As for us, we'd planned that any rain would be gentle at best and that untying the tarpaulins would be a quick and easy job. But because the rainfall was so fast and furious, and because the covers were folded like a crepe, those folds filled up with water in an instant, making them too heavy to unfurl. Strings that had tied them in place snapped. People were screaming. It was like a horror movie. Lena's intricate menus with the sweet little sketches were the first things to be destroyed in the carnage. It's said that only 1 or 2 survived. The food was ruined, the wine glasses toppled. Yelling to one another like sailors in a storm, several of the taller guests grabbed anything they could to poke and pull at the tarpaulins, which by now had swollen so much that they were collapsing. Some guests were standing on the tables, grasping at the tarps with their hands, only for buckets of rain to waterfall all over them and the tables. Me, I stood in the middle of it all, wet through and shaking my head in despair. I was speechless. Oh, what a disaster, I thought. And what did happen to Grandma? Most of the wedding guests lined up with their backs against the wall, seeking any kind of shelter they could find. My cousin, who was the photographer, couldn't believe his luck and bounded through the chaos, snapping away at the whole mess. The rain, like a tropical downpour, continued at full force for 5 minutes before easing into a gentle shower. But it was too late. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. The wedding is ruined, I thought to myself. That is, until something truly magical happened. From somewhere behind me came the sound of music above the chatter of the guests and the easing rainfall. It was Spanish music, dance music, gently building up and getting louder. I looked around trying to locate it. The guitars and the speakers had been whisked away, so the music wasn't coming from the band, that much was for sure. But where was it coming from? I spun around, searching for the sound through the rain, the flying tarpaulins and the soaking guests. Then I saw him. It was Greg, the Frenchman, with his music box strapped defiantly to his chest. His white shirt was plastered to his skin from the rain, but he had a determined grin on his face and fire in his eyes. He was winding the handle faster and faster, and the music came out louder and clearer. The music, that sweet music, was drowning out everything else. Lena's uncle, famed for his speed in hitting any dance floor, ripped off his tie and fastened it around his head, then stepped out from the shelter and into the rain. At first it was one man, alone, dancing like a maniac as the music box continued to sound its energetic siren call. Then another guest joined the dancing, and then another. The music was contagious. Aurelian, the guitarist, found the marching band drum tucked behind the door, strapped it to his own chest, and started pounding it in time to the music. And then quickly, unexpectedly, and miraculously, and as the rain continued to fall on them all, everyone started dancing. The wedding was saved. As if we'd been hypnotized, we danced until the rain stopped. Even the shyer guests who'd taken the back seats during the afternoon's proceedings lost their inhibitions and joined the fun. Meanwhile, the most responsible and practical guests worked furiously in the background, cleaning the tables, sweeping away the water, and removing the soggy menus. Before we knew it, the rain had stopped, the sun was back, this time for good, and we all sat down to enjoy the evening. I'd love to say that the rest of the night was perfect, and it really was close to perfect. In fact, the guests still talk about how the downpour was one of their finest wedding memories, but there was one last cursed surprise for me and Lena. When we'd danced our last dance and decided it was time to go back to the bridal suite at 4 a.m., we realized we'd forgotten one important thing. Lena, have you got the key? I asked her. Shit. She'd left it in the hotel room in the mad rush to get to the church. And the hotel reception desk was closed for the night. So was the front door to the hotel, actually. And there was no way in. We tried every trick in the book to get into that hotel, but we were doomed to fail. We ended up watching the sunrise from the outdoor lounge chairs in the bars. Yes, the bridal suite went unused that night, and we ended up crashing on a mattress in a room of passed-out wedding guests. I fell asleep wondering how it would have gone down if we'd rented a chateau in France. When all the guests had left Sweden, It was time for us to board our own flight back home to France, where we'd prepared for a honeymoon adventure. On the plane home, I met an elderly French couple in the seats beside me. They were curious to hear about the wedding, and I mentioned the monsoonal rain. The woman, with a kindly smile, pointed out a neat little bit of French wordplay.
Ah, we have a saying in France. Mariage pluvieux, mariage heureux. Which means an old marriage is a happy marriage. But another interpretation is mariage pluvieux, mariage heureux.
C'est vrai ça, ma chérie. It's pronounced the same, but it means a rainy wedding makes a happy marriage.
The elderly woman smiled at me.
You see, it rained at our wedding too. And we've been happy for 47 years.
Well, there you have it. That was the wedding chapter. A lot of sound effects in there, a lot of music, a lot of editing, but totally worth it. A very special day in my life, of course, and in Lena's too. A few cameos in there that you maybe recognized or maybe didn't. That's all the fun of it. You guys who listen to the show carefully will probably recognize maybe half a dozen voices in there, or characters at least. But I thought I'd finish this one with a very special character who very briefly appeared in that chapter, and that's my grandma. She's 87 years old. She came over to Sweden for that wedding, and I thought after I got her voice, you maybe heard the bit where she says, "Oh my goodness," before the rain starts. I figured I'd hang around and chat a little bit to hear her memories on that wedding, and indeed on this book and this audio experience. So settle in, here's me chatting with Grandma about that very day. Here it is. So, Grandma, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
How are you?
Fine. I'm fine. Yeah, fine.
Well done on your first voice acting job there.
Say it again, darling.
I think congratulations on your first voice acting job.
Oh, that's all right. I've done acting before, you know.
Well, never via Zoom.
Oh dear, no, never by this.
I was hoping that you'd walk me through how you remember that rain at the wedding, because you were sitting really close to where we were, and you were next to Lena's dad. How do you?
I was opposite Lena's dad, because we were on the main table, so I was sitting opposite, and we were having a conversation about the weather. And he said, and when it starts, you'll know. And as he said that, a big drop of rain came on the table. Boom, you know. And I thought, oh my goodness. And I don't think I said anything else because you knew it was just coming down. So I just grabbed this, whatever it was on the table, paper, I put it on my head and then made a dash for the steps that were behind me. I hadn't been down there, so I didn't know where I was going. Right. And I just went further along and there was a door open. So I went in this door and people were in there already. And they said, "Come in." And I went into this little room and sat down, and we all sat there quite cozily.
Right. Where were you? Because from my perspective, one of my first thoughts, and I know other people's as well, were, where's Grandma?
Well, that's where I'd gone. I tell you what, we were all sitting there talking, and somebody came in. I don't know whether it was your mother. Somebody came in and said, "Oh, Mum, we've been looking everywhere for you." I said, "I'm all right."
I heard rumors that you jumped up on the table and ran along it.
I didn't. No, I didn't.
What about, I imagine you've been to a lot of weddings in your time.
Not a rainy one.
Really?
Yes, honestly.
How many weddings have you been to?
Oh, goodness, I couldn't count them, could I? I couldn't count the amount of weddings I've been to, but I've never been to a rainy wedding.
But if before we get to the rain, if you had to guess about the number of weddings, is it closer to 20 or 50 or 100 or?
Oh, Oliver, I'm 87. I can't remember.
All right, okay. I won't push you then. But if you go back to being in your mind and you saw the rain was beginning, was your first thought, "Oh my goodness, this is terrible"?
No, I'd be truthful. I think we were all sitting there in our lovely clothes, weren't we? And hair done and everything, and the bride. And I thought, I didn't think that, I really didn't. That these drops came, and they weren't just drops of rain. They were boom. It came down like that, didn't it?
Yeah.
And I didn't think. I just thought, oh. And I just jumped up, didn't even think of anybody else. I thought they'd all be too busy looking after themselves to bother about me. So I made good the exit, put it that way.
You've read my book.
Yes, dear, and started it again.
Okay, well, I'm interested, firstly, do you think, if anything, I told the wedding scene fairly, or do you think I exaggerated it, or...
No. I was looking forward to getting to it.
Yeah.
But it was pretty good. Yeah.
Great. And then I'm just interested to hear your review of the book in general. I know you're biased.
Listen, the review of the book was wonderful. And I'm telling you, anybody that loves Paris would love it. It was interesting for me because I've not been to Paris. And when I was reading it, I thought he must have written this down as he went along, because he couldn't have remembered everybody's name and all that he spoke about. So I knew that you'd put a lot into that. I knew you had. But it was, yes, I have enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed it. And plus the fact that as I don't need to listen to you reading it, because as I read it, I could hear you reading. I could hear you. It was like listening to you to read the book.
That's a lovely review. Thank you, Grandma. And I'm going to finish on this note. I know you're 87, and I know we're all locked down, but if I one day kidnapped you and brought you to Paris, how would you feel about that?
I hoped I would get there one day, but one never knows. I mean, it's enough for me, really, I think now. I've got to feel well enough. I mean, we have periods of not being so well. So we were only talking the other day, and we were saying that though we feel reasonably good, at the moment, we probably would have been thinking of going away, but obviously we can't. And it doesn't look as if we're going to for a while anyway.
No, that's why it will have to be a kidnapping, of course. But Grandma, thank you so much for being part of this and lending us your voice. It's lovely, as always, to talk to you.
No, Oliver, it's a pleasure, my darling. And memories of you when I've been to Australia are so ripe in my memory that nothing can wash those away.
Oh, you're going to make me cry.
I think it's lovely for me to see you so happily married and happy in your life.
Oh, Grandma, it makes me happy to see you happy too.
Yes, well, I am.
and let's keep on doing it. Let's keep on being happy. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much, Grandma.
Right, my darling, take care. Love you. Bye.
And there you have it, chapter 7 already of the audio experience. There are only 9, so that means only 2 to go. Thanks to everyone for listening. It was really lovely, that ending with my grandma there. She was a big fan of the book and a big fan of the wedding. Hey, as for me, I just wanted to say a little thanks to everyone who's been sending in lovely messages. Only one of you, as far as I can see, put one of these lovely messages on as a review. So that is the one that I will read to finish off this week. It comes in, it's from Carl Beam, an old friend of the show. He says, "We are loving the audio experience book. The audio experience of Oliver's book titled Paris on Air has been great fun to listen to. We read the book when it first came out, even got our names in it somehow. And that he's thanks for that, Carl. He's referring to this book was self-published via Kickstarter. Thanks to Kickstarter, I funded the initial print run, and people could jump in a higher tier and get their name at the end, which is exactly what Carl did. And if it sounds like I'm talking as if I'm speaking to a baby, it's because there's a baby on my lap. But listening to it while driving home from Florida last weekend was highly entertaining. So while we await the return of the regular podcast, we'll enjoy the weekly installments of this entertaining book. By the way, Oliver's normal podcast is terrific. He explores the real Paris and then prepares detailed written guides that pair well with the audio. This podcast is regularly subject to conversation in our home. Our own photos and memories mixed with Oliver's interviews and explorations. Truly outstanding. Thanks, Mr. G, and salut, mon mec. Oops, pretend that never happened. And there's an in-joke for anyone who's read the book or listened to the show. Thanks, Carl. That's really nice of you. Oh, you like that one, did you? Salut, mon mec. That's enough for me, I think. Thanks for leaving the reviews. If you like this audio experience, you can always buy a copy of it or a copy of the paperback of the book, theeiffeltower.com/shop. Or if you want all the regular extras that Carl mentioned in his review, patreon.com/The Earful Tower. I'll leave you guys to it. I'll be back again with chapter 8 next week. That's the honeymoon chapter. We're going around France and we're doing it on a scooter. Are you ready? Let's go.
I don't really know where we are. I just wanna look